Just waiting for people to settle down. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the crude look at the whole conference of the Complexity program. This is the second day's program. And then this morning, we actually heard two very interesting talks on innovation. The first from Professor John Holland, and second from second about the Cambrian explosion and innovation from the ecological point of view. And I think we're going to have another very interesting talk to follow. And actually innovation is a correct theme to lead into this particular talk. That's by Professor Ying-Yi Hong from the Nanyang Business School. She joined NTU in 2008 together with Professor Chiu. And they co-founded the Cultural Science Institute in the Nanyang Business School in 2010. Her area of research, her background is actually, for her training, she was actually a social psychologist. After she received her PhD, she worked in Hong Kong from 1994 to 2002. Is that right? Yes. That was a very interesting transition period because Hong Kong was returned as a colony of the British Empire back to China to be ruled as a special administrative region. And of course, there was a lot of social anxiety at that point in time, and especially with respect to identity. Whether a Hong Konger will cease being a Hong Konger and start becoming a Chinese citizen. And she did quite a lot of research in that area and published extensively. And after that, she moved over to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she pioneered a brand new field over there, collaborating with neuroscientists. So what she did was she looked at cultural issues and then start collecting neuroscience evidence for the cultural issue. And this is the kind of work that she's continued doing after coming back after joining NTU. So, a few of the issues that she looked at besides identity is also creativity. So when does an individual becomes creative? And it turns out that in order for a person to become creative, whether as a business leader or as an inventor or as a scientist, you need to be placed in, they need to be taken out of their comfort zone. They need to experience cultural tension, and then that kind of spurs the creative juices that then flows out. So, and recently she started working on more on how culture influences cognitive processes in individual human beings, in groups, as well as in a larger collection of groups, and also the other way around, how cognitive processes feed into culture. So, so without me trying to give the talk on her behalf, let me just introduce Professor Ying-Yi and let her tell you the story herself.
Thank you so much for Sri Ann's kind introduction. And then thank you, Yang, for inviting me here to talk. And so, I think today we all know that we live in a complex world. And then there are pictures that I took around the world. For example, here, Hong Kong, and here, guess where? Singapore. Actually, it's Jurong Point. Yeah. If you live around this area, it's quite complex. Yeah. When you go there and you see, bunch of people who come from a mixed ethnic racial background. And in this ever more complex world, there are a lot of things that we need to cope with. And so there are needs for us to coordinate and adjust and change to meet with these challenges. And in this talk, I want to use the research evidence from my lab pertaining to the complex nature of our social world to demonstrate that culture is dynamic, culture is adaptable, and then culture is emerging. Now, I attend the first complexity conference last year. More is different. And then there is one thing that stuck in my mind for a year, and it's an unforgettable video from last year. So I want to start with that. I want to share with that, and let's see. Now, I want to use this video. I want to draw an analogy to culture. So all these metronomes are individuals, and then the cans are conduit for them to coordinate. And so in culture, what the cans can be drawn as a metaphor to the shared assumptions and lay beliefs that a group share, and these provide a conduit for individuals in a group to synchronize and coordinate their behaviors. And how pervasive are the shared assumptions or lay beliefs? Why are they important? Now, let me give you another demonstration. So look at this surface. It's like, moon surface. And when you look at this, most of us will see these three bigger dots as protruding, right? Yeah, you have this percept. And then perhaps properly, these are concave to the ground. But why do you have that perception? Have you asked yourself? What are the underlying assumptions? Exactly. So the light comes from the top, the light source from the top. So the upper end will receive the light while the lower end will be in the shade, okay? So these assumptions fit into the ecology that we are in, and then we use this assumption of the direction of the light and to infer what we'll see in this three-dimensional world. And when a group of people live in the same ecology, we will have the same type of assumptions. And these assumptions got also shared among our daily dialogue, our conversation, etc. However, emergent, if you are from another planet or you are living in another ecological environment, if the light source actually comes from below, what will you see? Probably now, immediately, especially these three dots, you immediately see it as more protruding rather than concave into the ground. Now, I just want to use that as a leverage, as an example to introduce the first two postulates in a theory that we proposed some years ago. So this is called a dynamic constructivist approach to culture that we proposed in year 2000 in a paper that published in American Psychologist. And here we define culture as networks of shared meaning, such as lay beliefs, that are produced, distributed, and reproduced among a collection of interconnected individuals. And I know that there are many ways to define cultures, and this is one of the way, and also the way that we operationalize culture in our own research. So I want to put that up front. And also, people acquire theories about the world from their cultural groups, as what I said in communication. Actually, you also learn about these. And then these theories are tools that people use to interpret and understand specific domains of our social world. Now, in the talk follows, I want to draw your attention or make a case that the dynamic constructivist approach can be used to understand and study a wide range of phenomena from micro level, brain activation, to more macro level social issues, for example, intergroup relations. And also it has implications for social harmony. How so? I will use some cartoons. So at the very beginning of this talk, I'll talk about some brain data, brain research, and then followed by some interviews, okay? And then after that, I will talk about some experiments, and these experiments involve self-report or the choices people display, and also some skin conductance evidence. And then at the end, we will go into the dry light zone. And I won't tell you just yet what this is, but keep you, hopefully it will be a pleasant surprise. Yeah, we'll see. Now, let's start about the brain. Dick Nisbeck, a professor at University of Michigan, and also actually who authored a book with John Holland years ago. His group have done extensive research to show that Chinese and Americans have different behaviors as to how they look at, for example, pictures. And for example, if you look at this picture, okay, so there is a focal object, an airplane, over a landscape, right? So this is the focal object, this is the background. And there are extensive evidence in terms of behavioral, memory, and eye tracking to show that Americans pay more attention and also focus more on the focal object. And whereas Chinese, in comparison, actually focus more on the context. Okay? Now, my colleagues and I some years ago thought that, can we replicate this or can we see this even in the neuroimaging, using neuroimaging techniques? So the specific areas that we looked at is the object processing area, lateral occipital complex. So it's here and here on the two sides. And so it has been widely studied already, this area. And so we focus on this area. Now, the technique we use is functional magnetic resonance adaptation. It's a mouthful, yeah. But actually, the logic is not that complicated. Let me go through this with you. So let's say we show you two pictures, same picture, identical picture, quickly. And then I look at the signal at the LOC area. LOC area, I just told you that is object processing. And then, so the first picture, when you see it, is indicated by the yellow line here. So it has activation because, the brain is saying, a picture. Yeah, look at it. Yeah, there is an object. And then the second, again, the second picture come up, but it's an identical one. You see the light blue. The light blue is lower, have lower magnitude than the yellow one because it's the same picture. So your brain quiets down, okay? So it's called adaptation. Yeah, it's not interesting anymore. Your brain has processed the information just now. So if you add these together, this is the resulting, curve if you look at succession of quickly presenting images, all right? But if you show two different pictures quickly, then you will have a bigger summation because the two yellow line, they say, this is new. Yeah, I process it again, all right? Now, so this is no repeat. this is repeated. And if you compare the two, no repeated have a higher summation than the repeated. All right? So we took advantage of this logic. And in our research, what we did was we show participants different types of pictures, and each time is 4 in a row, very quickly, okay? So one type is called novel concurrent. That is 4 pictures quickly, but the picture is situated in a concurrent background. So it's a typical background. For example, here, a camel in the desert, or a deer in the jungle, okay? And this is non-repeated. But we also have repeated concurrent, which is, for example, a pot on a stove, okay? Is typical. Now, but interestingly, we also create some bizarre stimuli. So we use Photoshop and other things, and have some of these bizarre pictures. So the focal objects are not typically appearing in this type of background. For example, a cow in front of a elevator lobby. Okay, so these are bizarre pairing, and then you have repeated in concurrent as well. Here, you got the idea. Now, why we want to do that? It's because actually there are, aside from Digny's best group, and also there are literature that's shown that Chinese people are very contextual sensitive and also sensitive towards the relationship of things in the context, okay? Now, so if that is the case, then we hypothesize that Chinese would show greater adaptation to incongruent stimuli consistent with their tendency to process contextual relationship more extensively than do North Americans, okay? So again, this illustrates, you know, in the bizarre incongruent, and this is the repeat bizarre incongruent. So you will see this bigger magnitude here, yeah. And then this is the congruent, so the magnitude would not be that big. And these should be especially salient or big in magnitude for Chinese participants than for North Americans, okay? So that's the prediction. Now, so we ran this at UIUC when I was teaching there, and we have 16 Chinese participants, mainly, you know, grad students who just arrived. Yeah, so we just grab them, yeah, go up and grab them. And then, so they are Mandarin speaking, and they have never lived in the United States before or elsewhere before. And then we matched their gender, age, and all the background with 16 Euro-Americans who were local there, okay? And then we scanned them using functional MRI technique. So these were the 4 type of stimuli, and then these were the sequence of presentation. Now, so if you were in the scanner, you will see something like that. And it's passive viewing. That means you just lie down, don't go to sleep, yeah. And then, but you don't need to make a decision. You don't need to make any response. You just look at the pictures that we show, okay? Now, in terms of structure, yeah, we did a structural scan first. In terms of structure, the Chinese and Euro-Americans are the same, okay? Good news, we are not different, yeah, in terms of the structure. So again, also we can identify the LOC area quite clearly, left and right, okay? So we make use of this and then look at their activation as a function of the different type of cortex, the pictures that we show. And here, this is for the Chinese participants, American participants, the same here. And this is the left LOC area, and this is the right LOC area. And what you see is that as we have predicted, so this is already the repeated, no repeated minus the repeated, okay? The magnitude here, as what we have predicted, the Chinese really keep firing, yeah, in the LOC area when they saw this incongruent bizarre pairing, all right? And this was true in the left LOC area for Chinese, and it's significantly different from the congruent one. And Americans, yeah, as what we have predicted, they didn't have that response, yeah. And then on the right-hand side, we also saw that, and Americans didn't have that. If anything, it's a little bit reversed, but it's marginally significant, okay. Oh, actually, it's not significant. Now, what's the summary of this? These results indicate that Chinese participants, Chinese subjects, are more sensitive to contextual incongruence than were Americans, and that they react to incompatible object background pairings by focusing greater attention on the focal object. So what? Yeah. So I think, this is a good exercise for me to understand neuroscience, because at that time I was really learning and designing and very much into it. I said, oh, so cool, yeah. But after all, it's a pretty little study. So what? What's the implications for this? First, as I said, good news. There are no cultural difference in terms of the regions. Yeah. So not a constitutional difference. But the neurological difference reflect different strategy, different processing foci. And now the question, a more interesting question, is could this be changed? Okay? And this brings me to the one of the important postulates in our model, which is, in this model, we contend that after extensive exposure to multiple cultures, individuals can acquire multiple layer theory systems and can dynamically switch between cultural frames. Okay? So actually, when we proposed this, we thought, oh, that's cool. But then what it follows from year 2000 is that there are a whole host of new ways to study culture. So previously, it was cross-cultural research. Basically, you sample from one cultural background or people from one cultural background or nationality, and then sample from another and then compare them. But after this proposal, actually now we can manipulate. We can randomly put people into different cultural frames and look at the consequence. So this would afford more causal inference in our own research. Now, how does that, what does that mean? What's the experiential feelings about that? So I think this painting really illustrates that very nicely. So this is from Frida Kahlo's, and it's entitled Self-Portrait on the Borderline Between Mexico and the United States. And then it was painted in 1932. And so some of you might be familiar with Frida Kahlo's work, and so you can see her face here. And so you can see, actually, on one hand, she was holding a Mexican flag. She is a Mexican artist, very famous Mexican painter. And then on the other hand is what? A cigarette, okay? Very interesting. And also the background is half covered by an illustration of a lot of industry, If you look at the original, actually you can see F-O-R-D there, Ford, yeah. And so you might not be too surprised, actually, when she painted this, she painted in Detroit, yeah, when she was living there. She lived in the United States for, periods of time, an extended period of time. But on the other hand, on the other side, this is more Mexican indigenous culture. Yeah. So you see the Mexican pyramids, fertility figures, artifacts here, and then some plants, vegetation, cactus. And so from her own correspondence to friends, actually she explained that the goal of this painting is to express her feeling of falling between the culture and also her sense of isolation and loneliness at that time when she was staying in Detroit. Yeah. And we will come back to this point, but nonetheless, you see this type of consciousness or awareness of the two cultures within an individual. Now, so this is another demonstration. The phenomenology of cultural frame switching. And it's from our own interviews. So we interviewed Chinese Americans who lived in the United States. And for example, in this interview is from a students who grew up in Taiwan, come to the United States and study there for some years. And he said that, well, since I lived in both places, Taiwan and the United States, and like every year I go back to Taiwan and to visit, I find myself changing within the two cultures. It's like I go back to Taiwan, they sometimes got scared of me because I'm too open and stuff. So I try to be more and more like fit into their definition. But when I come back, I sometimes feel myself a little bit overwhelmed, like, oh, everybody's so open, but then after like a month, I get used to it. And then I go back to Taiwan again, and then they're not used to me again. So it's like a cycle, kind of. So you see him trying to adjust, every time when he go back and forth, back and forth. So all these are very nice things, but how to do an experiment? So we were fascinated by the phenomena and fascinated by all the manifestation of that. But how to do an experiment and how to study it? So we developed a way we call cultural priming. Let me illustrate what do I meant by cultural priming. So let's say Chinese American biculturals. These individuals have been extensively exposed to both Chinese culture and American culture. And we think that, according to our theory, because you can learn new culture, you can acquire culture, and all these acquired knowledge system will be tools for you to see the world. And so here I use a metaphor. This person, bicultural individuals, should have both the Chinese cultural system and the American cultural system in the brain. But this is just a metaphor. So I don't mean that Americans reside here in the prefrontal lobe and then the Chinese reside in the occipital lobe. No, it's just two systems in the same person's mind. And then, so the cultural priming method is through external stimuli. So here one way is use cultural icons. For example, the Great Wall here. When a Chinese American see the Great Wall, this cultural symbol actually remind them of the Chinese way, Chinese knowledge system. So it got activated, or we say the accessibility of the Chinese knowledge come to the head, like increase the accessibility of that knowledge. Now, the Statues of Liberty, again, similarly, can activate the Chinese knowledge system. Now, so with that in mind, actually, the general hypothesis we have is that if you expose participants who are bicultural, let's say here Chinese American, to the respective cultural primes, immediately their accessibility of the corresponding cultural system should be higher than the other. Okay? And then so they should display behavior or thinking or even emotions that are typical of that culture. Okay? Now, so in our early study, what we typically do is to find a group of Chinese Americans and then randomly assign them to one of these priming conditions. For example, Chinese cultural priming, American cultural priming, or the control, the neutral pictures, which doesn't have any meaning in culture. Okay? And then they will be shown these icons, and then afterwards we measure their responses. All right? Now, so what can we measure? Actually, there's a whole host of things that we can measure. And give you a very simple example. We can use a picture, something like this. A picture of a blue fish swimming ahead of other fish. Why is the blue fish swimming ahead of other fish? That was the question we posed to our participants. Why? Well, there are various reasons. You can say that this fish wants to seek food. This fish is a leader, right? This fish might be finding something interesting in front, so it swims in front, okay? Now, but actually, you can also say like, oh, this fish, the blue fish, is being chased by other fish, okay? So it can put the causal foci in the target, which is the bluefish. And we call this type of attribution internal causes attribution, internal attributions. The bluefish is leading other fish, so it's internal to the target. Or external causes. For example, the bluefish is being chased by other fish, which is external to the bluefish. Okay? Do you see the locus of causality? Yeah, differ here. Now, one very robust finding, many people have demonstrated that, is that Chinese people make more external attributions than do Americans, and also other Westerners, whereas Westerners make more internal attributions than do Chinese and also other East Asians. And that's quite robustly found. So now the question is, if that is the evidence already, can our priming method actually activate that and show that? Yes, yeah, and we have done many versions of this, variation of this. Indeed, it's shown, yeah, in different ways that we measure this. Yeah, using fish, using a picture of pig, horse, or stories, yeah, or other social scenarios, we still can find this. And so this is an illustration of the outcome. So 3 groups of Chinese Americans, we randomly assigned to these conditions: American picture, neutral, and Chinese. And then the participants in the Chinese pictures conditions make more external attributions than did the American than participants in the American conditions. Okay. And so far, actually, the evidence is quite huge already. So we have demonstrated cognition in terms of external versus internal attribution, behaviors. We can put people in prisoner dilemma games and observe their competition versus cooperation. Still, we find the cultural priming effect, so cooperation versus competition, or affect, yeah, relational versus egocentric emotional projection. We find this evidence in that. Now, the question, does it work on Singaporeans? And yeah, so Singapore, you know, is a place where East meets West, right? So Singaporeans are arguably biculturals as well, just like Chinese Americans or Hong Kong Chinese. Actually, we have also done it on Hong Kong Chinese, and it works. Does it work? Yes, it does. Actually, colleagues in business school have demonstrated, yeah, and colleagues in psychology department here at NTU also have demonstrated. So this is one example. My colleague Sharon Ng from the marketing division at Nanyang Business School. So she have like icons like this, Singaporean icons, and you see Singapore airline here, Singaporean flag. And this is Mr. Kasu, yeah, also featured here. And then, so the US corresponding icons. And then the dependent measures was consumer behaviors. And she also find very consistent effect. And we have dependent measures as managerial practice or Chiling's research on internet behavior. Yeah, you can look at people's behavior on Facebook or Renren, yeah, which is the correspondence of Facebook in mainland China. Now, how does this relate to brain research? If we tie it back to brain, does the brain change, or can the brain adapt to priming? Okay, let me show you something. Now, Eastern and Western culture, yeah, there are many theories, and one well-cited is Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama's theory about different self-construal. So in their theory, they said, you know, typically in Western cultures, individuals are more independent. Yeah. So the self and the close others might be disjoined or somewhat disconnected. Whereas the Easterners, East Asians, cultures are more interdependent. So the self might overlap with close others. And under these different conditions, when you evaluate the self, in the Western concept, the independent self-construal concept, you evaluate self in more general terms. For example, I'm talkative, okay? Now, in Eastern because yourself also include particular others, then you evaluate yourself more contextually. Yeah. So you will think, okay, I'm talkative with my close friends. So it's very specific to a certain relationship. Okay? So the two types of self-control might give rise to different relevancy of the self. Now, so this was conducted by Joan Chow, a professor at Northwestern University. So she used this, based on this theory, she did some functional MRI study. So she recruited participants from Japan, Japanese from Japan, and then Caucasians from America. Yeah, I think it's from mainly around her school, so from the state of Illinois. And so there were different tasks for the participants to do. So when they were lying down, they were like reflector screen, but they need to make decisions according to different tasks. There are baseline font, so is the word below, is it italic or not? Okay, the participants press the button, yes or no. Okay, so this serves as the comparison control. Now contextual, watashi no haha ni hanashita bai. So this is like the translation when talking to my mother. Okay, so Japanese and then the English. And so they were asked the same question, but they need to respond. And this is more contextual response because it's like what I said, is specific to a relationship, okay? And now, general, 一般的 kini is in general. Yeah, in general, how you describe yourself. Now, so this is more relevant for an interdependent self or a more collectivistic self, right? And this is more relevant for a more individualistic, independent self. Okay? And then she looked at the brain area, medial prefrontal lobe, which has been found to be processing self-related information. And indeed, what she found, interestingly, is that if you look at the individual value orientation, whether they are more collectivistic or individualistic, and that would predict whether they would do more prefrontal, medial prefrontal lobe recruitment. That is the activation there. So from this chart, you can see the contextual one. Actually, people who hold a more collectivistic values will recruit that more than the individualistic. People who report more individualistic values. And then the reverse was true for general, like in general, how do you feel? Or how, in general, are you talkative or not, okay? And the interesting thing here is that actually Joan recruited participants from Japan and also from the United States. But what she finds is that actually these geographical locations didn't constrain people. And what predicts is the individual's own propensity, whether they are more collectivistic or individualistic. Okay, all right. Now, that is not all, because this is just between group or across individual associative research. It's correlational only. Now, she used priming method. And in another paper she published, she primed people first, and she used a story or a question. These are different methods to prime. For example, in the individual prime, the participants read a story that tells certain target person. So a story, for example, here is about a royal is chosen based on his merit, versus he was chosen based on his family relations. Okay, and then the right as a task is what makes you unique from your friends or family. What do you have in common with your friends and family? So participants, these are Asian Americans, were randomly assigned into either of this group, okay? And then they were given in this group individual prime, and then in this group collective prime. And then she ran the same procedures as she did in the last study, okay? And indeed, she found the switching effect there as well. So after priming, activating the cultural frame, people indeed, for example, contextual, again, you saw this earlier, the similar pattern earlier. That is the collectivistic prime would make people record more medial prefrontal lobe on the contextual questions. And the reverse was true for the general questions. Okay? So this was a very good demonstration of how the cultural priming, when people acquire new culture, actually they were able to switch between, and it has effect on their cognition, behavior, affect, and here is even the neurological activation. Now, so this summarizes that multicultural mind acquire, we can acquire, represent multiple cultural knowledge, pretty cool, right? Cool in the sense, yeah, this is nice finding. However, this is just half of the story. Yeah, it's just half. Why? Because we're not passive receiver of these multiple cultural influence. The other half is, I call it multicultural self, which is we will react towards the implications of this new culture to the self. We ask who we are. Are we really, for example, many Chinese Americans would ask, are we really an American? Yeah. Would I become a true American? Okay. So I think these, or if you see all these things like in a culture which now have new culture coming in, and people might see it as a contamination of their indigenous culture. So the receive of the new culture might not necessarily be cool, okay? Now, this is another illustration. So this is a Filipino painter, artist. And the title of her painting is A Racial Identity Crisis, okay? Now, so she portrayed herself in Spanish garments, Spanish outfit. But on the other side, very divided, is her image in the more indigenous traditional outfit. And she thought it's all divided with a rigid boundary. So yeah, tying back to John's talk early on. So she indeed see a rigid boundary on the two parts of the South, and she felt divided. So close encounters with foreign cultures can evoke hot, exclusionary responses. But how to predict that? Again, we need to do experiments. Yeah, and although there are a lot of literature on that, and you see it in the arts and in people's self-reflection, but can we really bring it in and do some experiments on it? And so one thing is we need to identify a predictor of who would respond in a cool way and who would respond in a hot way. So years ago, my students and I thought, okay, how about we bring in a concept that has been studied in anthropology and discussed in anthropology quite widely, which is racial essentialism. And racial essentialism is defined as race reflects inherent accents, disposition. Race is indicative of a person's ability and traits, and racial characterization is unalterable. So these are the features of this type of belief, okay? And in our own lab, we need ways to measure or manipulate. So there are two ways. You can measure participants' chronic beliefs, that is their endorsement. Yeah, belief in this racial essentialism using questionnaire. We use self-report. For example, these are the samples items. To a large extent, a person's race biologically determined his or her ability and traits. How a person is like, for example, his or her ability traits is deeply ingrained in his or her race, and it cannot be changed much. Okay? People read this statement and tell us, honestly, yeah, or spontaneously, do you believe or not believe? Race are just arbitrary carries and can be changed if necessary. Racial carries are constructed totally for economic, political, and social reasons. If the socio-political situation changes, the racial carries will change as well. So to extend 1 to 6, yeah. And these are reverse items, okay? So on this scale, the higher score, meaning the more endorsement of racial essentialism, okay? So how's the distribution like? And actually, I discussed this with many colleagues in the United States, and they cannot believe in it. They thought that people won't agree with this. But no, actually, it's quite beautifully, normally distributed, we call it. So I have extensively surveyed undergraduate students at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and then, yeah, it's quite widely distributed in a normal distribution, meaning there are a good portion of people who agree, yeah, and then there are a good portion of people who disagree, okay? So how about in Singapore? So far, we're still collecting data, but again, we replicate. And this is Singapore data, and these are real data points, yeah, and from 101 Singaporean students we have collected so far. And you can see, again, it's a normal distribution, okay? And people can reflect and tell you whether they agree or disagree, yeah, with these type of beliefs. So this is one way we can measure, but also we can manipulate, we can activate the temporal accessibility, that is the temporal awareness of these theories, and also we convince people that this is true, yeah, this is the reality. And how so? Usually as a social psychologist, we use a little bit of deception, yeah. We lie a little bit, yeah, for the sake of science, yeah. But at the end of at the end of the section, we will debrief, always tell the truth, yeah, to our participants. So we lie a little bit. When participants come in, we will say, okay, now, in this study, we have multiple tasks for you to do. So we begin with a reading comprehension task. We are interested in how people process information, reading essays. So in the following, I will give you an essay that we got from Times Magazine. Yeah. Please read it carefully, and we will ask you questions afterwards. Okay? So participants, half of the participants were given this article. And it says, the mystery of race, there is accents underlying racial groups. The concept of race has divided humankind into meaningful social groups based on differences in their innate qualities. Okay, so the details were very convincing, yeah, about experiments, etc., all supporting this view. Okay, half of them read this. The other half read this. The mystery of race, the meaning of race is socially constructed. It is used to characterize different racial groups, and equally convincing evidence. And actually, we wrote this, yeah. So they were made up by us, and we pretested extensively. Undergraduate students really believe that these are, taken from Times Magazine. And so we know that students will be convinced, and then these, different mindset will be active in their mind, at least, immediately after reading the articles. So what's the effect of reading these articles? So, for example, in one study, we asked Asian Americans to read these articles, and then immediately we look at their Asian identification and American identification, and we see a drastic difference here. So if you read the social construction article, the Asian and American identification were pretty high, yeah. But if you read the racial essentialism articles, the Asian identification, identification with Asian culture remain high. However, the American identification with American culture dampened, okay? And why? Yeah, it's logical, because if you think that race really rigidly characterizes a person and you cannot change that, what's the use of identifying with American culture, as American culture is a very, predominantly white, culture, and certainly not Asian culture, okay? So for these individuals, there's not much use to identify with American culture. Now, another task. You might say, okay, those are self-report. How about indirect tasks? Again, reading this article, and immediately we give participants this task. In the following list, among the 3 things listed together, please indicate which 2 of the 3 most closely related by circling each of those 2 words. So they were giving 3 things. 3 can be names, can be objects, and then they were circling 2 that are closely related. So they have like a whole list of things, and among these are our target. So for example, the first one, Jimmy Carter, Martin Luther King Jr., Barack Obama. Which 2 would you circle? Yeah, you can circle this one and this one, right? Because both of them are president, okay? Or you can circle this and this because both of them are African Americans, all right? Yeah, you got the point. Or this, Michael Jordan, Denzel Washington, Bruce Willis. Yeah. Again, you can circle Michael Jordan with Denzel Washington because both of them are African Americans, or Denzel Washington with Bruce Willis because both of them are famous actors. Okay? Now, so we look at, after reading this article, whether people are more aware of race and use race as characterization, basis of characterization. And indeed, that's what we find. Reading the racial essentialist article result in a higher likelihood of using race or picking out these objects using race. Now, so far, because I claim that actually it's a hot process, I haven't demonstrated hotness yet. Yeah, so I want to demonstrate the hotness. Actually, you really would sweat more. Yeah, how so? So there was a study in which we interview Chinese Americans. So we asked them to come into the lab, and then we did an interview that followed an attachment protocol, adult attachment protocol. Let me describe what that is for you. So they first come into the lab, one by one is individual interviews. And they will be asked some warm-up questions, yeah, not related to race or culture at all. And then afterwards, in phase 2, which is our target phase, we ask them to talk about their experiences with Chinese and American culture. And according to the protocol, we ask them to generate 5 words, and then use each of these words to relate to their personal experience with Chinese and American culture. Okay? And our hypothesis is that this would be really eliciting the hot process, because the hot exclusionary process is hard for you to switch between the 2 cultures, and especially for people who hold the racial essentialist belief. Okay? And then the end is final rest period. Now, while we interview them, actually we hooked them up with skin conductance measure. So they were wired in terms of we know how much they have sweat in comparison to their baseline when they first enter into the lab. And guess what? Indeed, so the question is, did participants' racial essentialism predict the increase in skin conductance, which is sweating? In the warm-up, no, because it's not related to their cultural experience. However, quite dramatically, in the second phase, when they will enter into talking about their cultural experience switching between, then the racial essentialism belief predict in a way that the more you believe in racial essentialism, you have higher increase in skin conductance, meaning you sweat more, more effortful, stressful for you. And then at the end, final phrase, rest, again, this disappear. Okay? So it's very specific about their own experiences and how they physiologically responding to it. And this pattern holds even when we control for their language proficiency, length of stay in the United States, and also the type of experience they recall, whether it's positive or negative. Okay? So the whole pattern stays. Now, an essentialist race theory sets up a framework within which the Chinese and American cultures are seen as discrete and non-overlapping Therefore, it is more stressful for them to pass between these cultural frames. And so far, in the past few years, my student and I have conducted a series of studies. And now the evidence is quite strong that racial essentialism, just by believing in it, or we activate it, would have a higher race-based categorization and cognition. So you're more sensitive, ready to categorize based on race. The identity and identification, you will have more ethnic identification and contrast from the mainstream culture. This is about Chinese Americans, or the mainstream if you are a minority in a country. And then cultural frame switching, having more emotional and cognitive difficulty in switching between cultural frames. So I just showed you about the emotional part. And then the cognitive part as well. We have a reaction time paradigm that shows that it takes them longer in terms of reaction time to switch. Now, the latest one, a paper that we just published in Psychological Science, also demonstrates that if you hold this belief, actually you are less creative. And we have evidence on that. And mainly because of the rigidity in categorization. And creativity, many research have shown that in order to be creative, actually you need to take concepts from one category and concepts from another category and to synthesize them, okay? And if you think the boundary is rigid and you have rigid categorization, it's harder for you to combine different concepts, and become creative. And we demonstrate that the whole process involved. Okay? And so to summarize, actually there are two parts. There is a more acquisition part, but this acquisition part, people are not passive. They also react towards it because we are reflexive. We constantly think about what's the meaning of that for me and for my culture. Okay? And then certain belief that your whole will affect the path that you go down. So far, that's what I think from the evidence that we gather, we are quite confident that's the case. But now I want to introduce or lead you into a twilight zone. That is, we are not yet firm on the findings, but we are very, very excited about this new development. And what are they? There are two things. One is psychological research in mainland China that we are actively doing. And the other is culture, genes, and molecular biology that our group is also doing. Okay, now, psychological research in mainland China. So if you know the history of mainland China, the education, was disrupted for 10 years during the Cultural Revolution. And psychology, especially social psychology, was restored very slowly after the end of Cultural Revolution. So now there is a whole, layers that is disconnected. So many young people are very aspire, talented, but they don't have mentor who are well-trained and mentor them. So my husband and I did voluntary teaching in different parts of China 5 years ago. And then our goal is to help the junior faculty members in mainland China and train them on social psychology, method, and research. And also at the same time, we learn a lot from these students too, because there are so many interesting social cultural topics that can be studied. And also, just to remind you, actually, Chinese population is 1/5 of the world population. So 20% of these individuals, these are the group that you can study under, the Chinese culture. Now, give you one example that this was from a class exercise that we did in one of the teaching when we were there. Each time when we went in, we go to different areas of mainland China. And usually we stay for about a month and teaching intensively there. And so one time, one of the group in my class were very interested in ethnic relations in mainland China. And China has 56 ethnic groups, and then Han is the majority group. And what is the relationship between the ethnic and national identification among the ethnic minorities? And actually, this is a big question, and that would give rise to a lot of the social harmony issues in mainland China. And at that time, we were here in Yunnan. I was teaching in Yunnan at that point. So Yunnan province has 26 ethnic groups. And so these were the pictures I took when I was attending one of their village celebration. So it's a very colorful, different custom, different traditions. So we are very interested in how these people identify with their own ethnic groups and whether at the same time they will identify with the nation, China. Okay? And so using the, let me introduce you to the method. We use a very simple method because many of them might not be able to read kanji, the words. So we use picture. So for example here, ethnic identification, 民族认同, 就是同族. So what they did was, what we did was 句子同族. So this is yourself, and this is the ethnic group. And we asked participants, just tell us which one will represent you. So if you, yourself and your ethnic groups is separate, so you would pick this one. But if you think that you are slightly close, very, quite close, very close, and or you yourself are embedded in the ethnic group, then you would pick that. So each participant pick only one picture. And similarly, 国家认同, national identification, the same thing. They need to pick one. And also, we modify our racial essentialism, put it into ethnic essentialism. We ask them those items, whether they agree with it or not. Now, what's the logic? What were our prediction? Our prediction was if you believe in ethnic essentialism, that is, you believe that race are fixed and alterable, and since Han is the majority group, so the 中国 is mainly Han, then you won't see yourself as compatible with that. Okay? So what it says is that you will see these two types of identification as antagonistic to each other. Okay? So either you identify highly with this or highly with that. So you should see a negative correlation between the two. Okay? But if you don't believe in this, then the two can be both high, both low, you don't have this antagonistic relationship. And that's indeed what we find. So red indicate high essentialism, and this is national identification on the vertical axis. Horizontal axis is ethnic identification. So you see the weak ethnic identification would be related to high national identification for the high, and then the reverse for the strong ethnic identification for high essentialism, but weak national identification. So you see the negative. And this is not selective. This slope is selective. But yet, because that's a class exercise, they did it on one day. They just went out and then grab people as many as possible. So it's a small sample. So this is twilight zone. That's why I said this is a small pilot, but it's promising. And actually now we are collaborating with National Academy of Social Sciences to do more systematic research on this in this regard. Now, culture, genes, and molecular biology. So how do I combine those? Now, the general models that we work on is something like this. We think that there are personal kind of tendency or personal dispositions that might affect the outcome. Personal influence including genes or the belief one hold, would create some factors within the individual. But also there are contextual factors. For example, the situational pressures, the past history of one's group, one's own past experience, the cultural norms. And all these would be relayed or mediated through a processing system, which is, we think that might be characterized by sensitivity and reactivity to situation. And all these could have implication or could lead to different intergroup relations. So more specifically, what we want to look at, what we look at is one genetic markers, which has been quite widely studied, serotonin transporter genes polymorphism. And in this polymorphism, actually, this is related to serotonin genes, and these are synapses, in our brain. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and then so it would be passed from one to another if there are a signal that goes through the neurons. But after it passes, actually, it has a mechanism that it should be reabsorbed up here. Otherwise, it would be flattened. Okay, and then in each individual, we have two alleles, and the two alleles have variants. Either they are short or long. So that gives rise to three different types: short, 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 long, long, long. And the short has been identified and studied, and that's associated with less efficiency in serotonin reuptake. Okay, so that means there are more serotonin flooding or concentration in the synapse for the people who have short, or one short, okay, than the long. Okay, so based on this, these were research from other labs. People have done some neuroimaging or behavioral studies on these genes. So the short allele is associated with greater amygdala reactivity. Amygdala is responsible for many of our emotional responses. Reactivity to threatening stimuli, fear conditioning, neuroticism, or depressive disorder symptom. Okay, so it has been widely studied. Now, our model is something like this. So we think that the short allele might respond to some internal conditions. For example, the lay beliefs that I have been showing you, and also external threat. It could be physical threat or social threat. Okay, and the two would give rise to greater sensitivity and reactivity among the short than among the long allele carriers. And that would have a whole host of outcomes. For example, prejudice, anger favoritism, or loneliness in a new culture. Okay? Now, do I have evidence? We are getting more and more evidence along this. So this is a study conducted by Bobby. Bobby here, my postdoc, and his former advisor, John Chow, whose work I have shown as well. And so in this study, Bobby collect data from Caucasian Americans, and it's conducted in the United States. And so what he measured is belief in a dangerous world, okay? And this is a widely used scale already. So we have low and high believer. And then he also genotyped these people. So long, long, and short. Short is meaning short, short, or short, long. So anyone who carry at least one will be characterized here, okay? And what you find, actually, for groups that are usually seen as threatening, for example, Arabs or schizophrenic patients, these threatening group, and if you also hold a high belief in dangerous world, and then you're short allele, actually your response is more extreme. You're more sensitive. That means if you have this belief, actually you show the highest amount of bias in both cases, in both groups. I mean for both groups, towards both groups. Okay. Now, these are association. How about in experiment? So we also run another study that he create groups. So he just randomly put people in groups and then let them play games. behavioral games with each other. And then there were a group that consistently cheat the participants, not giving fair share to you, okay? How will you respond to this group? So at the end, the participants were asked to allocate resources to a member of their own in-group or a member of that group that threatened you or are not fair to you. And so these were the results. The short, you can see, actually, again, this slope was significant. They were interacting with their beliefs, and 0 means fair allocation. The higher means you give more to your in-group at the expense of this out-group, okay? So again, you are more, you show more in-group favoritism. Huh? This one?
Why would you have predicted that people with low belief and short would actually not have very low in-group, as opposed to having no being the same as the other one?
No. That's a great question, because the model was about sensitivity and reactivity. So if they were in a conditions, for example, they don't believe in the world is dangerous. Yeah, they wouldn't believe in. They wouldn't be unfair to this outgroup. So here, what as allele did was it exaggerate the impact of both the internal and the external conditions. Yeah. So if you are short allele and then you hold a not so favorable belief, or and also here actually at the same time you are in a threatening situation, your responses would be the most negative. But if you don't hold this belief, you could be not showing that, or even reverse if you are in a good condition. Yeah. But that's a great point. Yeah. So, but the point is that it would be sensitive. They would be more extreme in their responses. Does it help? No? No? Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can discuss that more. Or you want to ask? Okay. But the point, I think, is helpful to clarify that. The point is that our proposal is that not saying that we have identified certain genes that are deterministic. That's no. Yeah. We don't believe in that. But I think, more importantly, we identify something that would put someone in a more vulnerable situation if they have other vulnerable factors or circumstances. For example, the lay beliefs, or if they are under threat, okay, and on. Now, this is just fresh from oven. So we also collect data here in Singapore with our own undergraduate students. And so in this project, we track undergraduates who go on exchange program, okay? We were very interested in them. So we get their cheat cell before they go. And now, actually, in these few weeks, we are getting their cheat cell again after they return. And then in the middle, actually, we also measure overseas when they, through internet, yeah, whether they are stressful or not stressful, etc. And so these students on exchange, and then this is from Desiree, yeah, who have worked days in, in the lab, and extracting DNA and trying to get their genotype in serotonin transporter genes. And this is easy to see because the extracted, alleles travel from here to here, yeah. And it's really long and short. So the longer ones are heavier, okay? So they travel slower and for a shorter distance, okay? So these are different individuals, and these are rulers only, yeah. So these are the individuals, different participants, and we look at whether they are, this is for us to look at whether they carry long, short, long, or short, okay? So this person is long, because both travel slow, and this person is short, long, because you can see both, yeah. And this is short, okay? So that is an easy way to look at, yeah. But we are now running more sophisticated procedures, but this is good for demonstration. So we got that, and at the same time, actually we have the measure of racial essentialism, remember that? Yeah. And also, we ask them whether they have a need to belong. Okay? High need to belong or low need to belong to a group. Do they care to be accepted in a group? And again, you can see, actually, you can see this differential effect. And this is the short pattern. The long, we didn't find any systematic pattern. But the short ones show a very interesting pattern. That is, if you have a high need to belong, yeah, you really care whether you belong to a group, and also your whole high racial essentialism are the people who show the highest loneliness when they are overseas. So the loneliness measure when they were overseas there through internet, we ask them, how do you feel? Okay. And then also the same thing as Robert asked, here, if you don't have a high need to belong, actually SS was not that bad. It's associated with the lowest amount of loneliness. Yeah. And so here, as you see, we don't know the whole puzzle yet. Yeah, there are still gaps there. But we see some promising results, and this is based on a very small sample. We are still need to go in and then recruit more participants. And if you have ways or you have source that we can go and get participants to sell, please come and talk to me. Yeah, really in need of help. Okay, so this is why I say it's twilight zone, because we are going into these areas that few people have gone before. It's really twilight zone, integrating all these. We see some promising results. We don't know at the end of the day whether we can put the puzzle together. But yet, we are very excited about it. Now, so it's near the end. I want to wrap up. I think, as I said, I want to say culture is dynamic. Culture is not a static thing. You see a lot of cultural mixing. Culture changes and adapt to new environment. And in the talk, most of the data is trying to illustrate the adaptability of people. So individuals in each culture can acquire new cultural meaning system, like, for example, lay beliefs. That's the construct that I work with. Lay beliefs from another culture and can switch between cultural frames. And it's emergent. New cultural phenomena can emerge as a result of cultural mixing, and also could be non-linear. Important social events can sway some people's responses and produce a different behavioral trajectory of a group. And I don't have time to talk about this. Actually, I also work on some of the psychological effect of 2005 Hurricane Katrina, and 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami. In there, actually, you see some type of switch in people's responses as a consequence of natural disasters. And I've been really fortunate to be able to work with a group of collaborators, highly interdisciplinary. So going into mainland China, I need local collaborators. For example, Beijing Normal University, a very good supporter. School of Psychology and National Key Lab of Neuroscience and Learning, and then Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And then local researchers, Michael Mini, who is a well-known molecular biologist specializing in genes, and Xiaolin Song, a professor in business school again, doing behavioral genetics related to business settings. And then my colleagues, George here, and then postdoc Bobby, and a bunch of very talented graduate students and research assistants. And very importantly, I have to acknowledge my funding agent, MOE, giving me tier 1, tier 2 grants. And if I may, to end my talk, I want to end with this, the science, the map of science, a very beautiful map. And actually, when I saw it, I went back and Googled it and then read the article, And if you look closely enough, you can see each of these disciplines. And this is my training, social and personality psychology. So I try to get from there to here, which is the brain research, and to genetics, and tie it back to social and personality psychology. And well, have been trying, yeah, still taking baby steps, still learning on the way, but hopefully, I can just, try to integrate all these areas. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you, Prof. Hong, for the very interesting talk. We now have some time for a few questions. Yes.
Sheila Ranis with Walsh College. My real question is, having traveled all over the world and experienced many different cultures, I think that the United States is changing so dramatically in its cultural makeup. And I think I'd be curious if you are considering intergenerational studies, because nobody other than American Indians are indigenous. So everybody is an outsider. And the American culture, although a lot of people think of it as what emerged from the British, is really gone.
Right.
And so I would be very curious as to how you define an American, Caucasian, who could be from 50 different nations on the planet. And what I think begins to change is with the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generations, when it is very, very difficult to distinguish who's who.
Yeah. A very, very good point, yeah. So how to define an American? Well, that's already a big subject matter by itself, yeah. And there are different theories about that. And in our own research, actually, we don't define, an American for our participants. Yeah, it's their own subjective experience. Yeah, how they define it and how that guide their own responses. And so in social psychological research, actually, there were studies that look at this very concept of American using IAT, we call it implicit association test, and look at how people associate it in an unconscious way. Yeah, so it's more like the collective unconscious of what an image of an American is like. And from that research findings, actually, still, many of the participants show an association, strong association of white American men, yeah, as the image, prototypical image of an American. But your point about change, I think, again, is an adaptive system with the demographic changes. Yeah, that will change as well. And then from...
White is no longer a majority.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So actually there are... Yeah.
In terms of sheer numbers.
Yeah. I think it's changing. Yeah.
In terms of babies born.
Yeah.
Which means it's only a matter of time.
So I think that's a great point about the demographic changes. But tie back to the subjective experience and also the subjective beliefs, we have data that show if you grow up, if you live in an environment which is more diverse, and also people engage more on the discussion of interracial issues, then you're less likely to hold a racial essentialism theory. But if you are in an environment which is more homogeneous in terms of race, and there's little discussion on that, then you are less likely. Actually, no. I should take it back. So it should be if you are in a more diverse environment, more discussion on interracial issues, you are less likely to hold a racial essentialism belief. But if the conditions is the reverse, actually you are less likely. So, yeah. So that is, I mean, even holding the belief as a lay person is affected by the very environment that they are in, and also the social discourse that they are in.
Greg Fisher. In an earlier slide, you had a title of evidence, and you had Prisoner's Dilemma games.
Yes.
I'd be really interested to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I have many extra slides. So this is the Prisoner's Dilemma game. So it's published in Science some years ago. So we run a typical Prisoner's Dilemma game paradigm. So we told the participants, you and your partner, if both of you cooperate, you will get 3 points, your partner gets 3 points, and then, but if you defect and your partner cooperate, then you get 4 points, more than your individual, when you cooperate. But then your partner, will lose, will suck, 0. And so the reverse here. And then, but if both of you defect, then both of you get 1 point only. So that's a typical Prisoner's Dilemma game. But we spin on it. How to do it is we run this in Hong Kong with Hong Kong Chinese college students. And our argument is that they are biculturals because of their background. And so before participants come into this game, half of them, we shown actually 1/3 of them, we shown the Chinese prime, 1/3 Western prime, and then the neutral, okay? So that's one thing, cultural priming. And then the second thing is who they play this game with, okay? So they play 5 non-feedback, 1 short task, but they know who they know which 5, but not really in terms of individual feedback. They were not giving feedback, okay? So in one group of the participants, they were playing with friends. In another group, they play with strangers they have never met before. But it's in the same section because they saw these people. But they never know, they were not given feedback. What type of options they have picked. Okay, so it's a 3x2 design. In terms of 3 different priming conditions, and then either with friend or stranger. So the vertical axis here is likelihood of choosing the cooperative strategy in a Prisoner's Dilemma game. So what you see is with friends in group, we show the typical cross-cultural findings. Chinese cooperate with in groups more. People who are under Chinese cultural prime. Then participants who went through the American cultural primes.
In group means they're friends?
Yeah, they're friends. Yeah, they're friends. But for stranger, this should be labeled as stranger, we don't see this effect. So it's very specific, of how you apply the accessible lay belief. So that brings to the applicability of the accessible lay belief. And actually, this is, again, a well-known finding that Chinese and American differ in terms of how they care, their responses towards their friends versus someone they don't know.
That suggests Americans are happy to cooperate with strangers.
Yeah. Not significantly different, but I think for one thing, they don't have a strong boundary, between that. They don't necessarily favor, their in-group, more. That's it.
Yes. Hello, Alain Wouters, Whole Systems. I found this really fascinating. Also, the way you bring together genes, memes, artifacts, context to the responses. I'm very interested in the inclusionary responses. And I have 2 questions relating to specific context.
Okay.
In South Africa, through scenario exercises, people have identified inclusion-exclusion to be a major uncertainty for the future of the country. We know today that the power is in hands of one of the ethnic groups, of which it is also known that the internal locus of control is strongest.
Oh, wow.
I have 2 questions. What would you suggest measuring in that society in order to get a sense of the propensity for inclusion-exclusion? And the second question is, what do you think could be the effect of cultural priming by publishing stories and articles in the newspapers or whatever to shift or to nudge the system in a particular direction? And what would be timescales involved?
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. You know, I don't know the specific context of that. Yeah, but I think one thing is that if you put a group of people, you know, together, people have ways to divide them up into us versus them. Yeah, and it's because people have a basic needs, according to Marilyn Brewer, that's called the need for optimal distinctiveness. So on the one hand, we want to be connected to others, but at the same time, we want to differentiate, we want to be unique. So that, you know, opposing forces are in constant, you know, actions in each individual. So I think returning back to your question, the very first thing I would ask is that, how do people exactly divide them up? I know that they can dividing up, you know, through different ways, but first, in order to get a sense of how I can prime them, I need to know, yeah, that, you know, background, the icons. And then after that, I would suggest, you know, we need ways that can maximize or, you know, ways to symbolize these different cultural systems. And then use that to work on people who already know the two. Yeah. But sometimes it's hard if there are emotional tensions in the group already. Just like what I show, if there are things that, you know, the emotional responses that might block the way, they might know the symbols of another culture, but they intentionally contrast away from it. And we have evidence. The more you show, for example, some Korean Americans who have this reactionary response, if you show them American cultural icons, they behave more in a, even more in a Korean ways. Yeah. So that could, you know, go back to the opposite direction. Yeah. So I think it's, yeah, it's very important to know the nuances, yeah, in the culture, and then try to use the symbol, but also use it in a way that is safe. So this interestingly tied to a research that we are conducting. We call it cultural attachment. So I briefly mentioned about that. So we borrowed John Bowlby's theory of attachment. Yeah. So the idea is that when we grow up, we attach to our caretakers. Okay. So culture, in a way, could be some kind of symbolic safe base, safe haven for us. And then we develop emotional attachment to it. So oftentimes when, especially people who travel abroad, yeah, when they feel stressful, they want to eat the cuisine of their native culture, or watch movies, or listen to their own cultural heritage music. Yeah. So that's the way for them to get back to the emotional attachment. So I think, you know, in that case, you can also look at the emotional attachment, you know, basis. And then, because that would add more on the emotional side, yeah, rather than the core, like cognitive knowledge, yeah. So both might be interactive.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, it's already 3, so I think if there's a burning question, we should have the question asked outside during the coffee
Okay,
break.
thank you.
But before we end this session, let me just present a
Yeah.
token of appreciation to
Thank
Professor
you.
Hong.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.